Hello, great and bountiful YouTube Empire, and welcome back to Zelda Map Mysteries. In the last episode, I theorized that the land of Termina is present in Breath of the Wild's Hyrule Kingdom. I established the likely locations of Clocktown, Woodfall, and Snowhead, and while much of the evidence seemed fairly straightforward, I still wouldn't quite call it conclusive. However, I think after today's episode, we'll be moving on from coincidental to near certainty. Without any further ado, let's jump right in. What? Didn't I say in the last episode South, East, and North Clocktown were all gone? I did, yes, but I need to admit I'm a bit on the fence on this one. You see, while it's all very likely that the other three Clocktowns are gone, I think there's the possibility of another option. Early on in my research, I was driven mad trying to figure out where Clocktown was. I had two candidates, the Tabantha Village Ruins, which, as you know if you saw the last video, is what I eventually decided on. The other option was the Majora Exchange. Looking at this area, it's a small circular square surrounded by crumbling walls. Personally, I think it does look an awful lot like Clocktown, but it just felt too small to me. Certainly too small to be the rest of Clocktown. But then, maybe not. Returning to an earlier theory I had scrapped by the time I wrote the last episode, I think that more than just West Clocktown may have survived the Tanager Canyon expansion. I think the Majora Exchange just might be what's left of South Clocktown, now split in half by the canyon. That said, I still think that North and East Clocktown are likely gone, having been destroyed by whatever caused Tanager Canyon to cut through it. Although there is that area with Pondo's Lodge just around the Hebra Tower. Anyway, I'm getting off track, let's move on. Switching back to our regularly scheduled program, we now look west as Link's journey takes him to the Great Bay in Majora's Mask. The Great Bay region is home to both the aquatic dwelling Zora and the pirates who may or may not be Gerudo. It may be worth noting that unlike the Zora found in the Zoras Domain in Ocarina of Time and most other Zelda games, the Zora present in Majora's Mask appear to be saltwater Zora, living in the ocean waters of the Zora Cape and the Great Bay coast. Well, finding the ocean on the west of Hyrule sounds like an easy enough task. Let's take a look at our trusty map and... Following the path to the west of the Tabantha Village Ruins brings us to the arid Tabantha frontier. Clearly there's water here, but it's definitely no ocean. Well, this sort of thing hasn't stopped me before, and who knows, given Hyrule's decline, maybe it makes perfect sense for an entire ocean to dry up. Actually though, if you check out that massive canyon separating Hyrule from the rest of the world, it seems to suggest that perhaps the ocean's receded by the time of Breath of the Wild? Anyway, if my map and this theory are to be believed, it seems that either Great Bay Coast is just gone, or it's somewhere in the Tabantha frontier. Well, no, not somewhere. It is the Tabantha frontier. Let's take a closer look and I think you'll start to see what I mean. The Tabantha frontier has perhaps its single most defining landmark in the Rito village. Wait a minute, the Rito? Well, I hope the cogs in your brain are turning because this is where we get into the first real shocking part of my theory, as if Termina simply existing in Breath of the Wild wasn't crazy enough. Let's take a moment to examine the Rito and figure out where they came from and how, of all places, they managed to find their way here. First, we ought to take a look at what we already know about the Rito as a race in order to uncover this mystery. As I'm sure many of you know, the Rito were first introduced in The Wind Waker, having evolved from the Zora after the goddesses flooded Hyrule beneath the Great Sea in the adult timeline. It's because of this fact that to have the Zora coexisting with the Rito almost seems like an oxymoron. They are essentially the same species. Them existing together is a bit absurd. Then again, it makes just about as much sense as a race of fish people evolving into bird people when the world is flooded. It doesn't make sense at all until you consider one thing. The Zora and Zoras Domain, from which the Rito and the Wind Waker evolved, were freshwater Zora. It would make sense then, in the Wind Waker, that when a whole bunch of salt water came rushing in, flooding the place, the Zora had to adapt. Although, adapting from a fish into a bird rather than evolving into saltwater Zora is still a bit strange. But hey, sometimes the goddesses don't seem to have all their marbles together. So that's how the Rito came about in the Wind Waker, sure. But what about in Breath of the Wild? Especially considering the fact that I've already claimed this game takes place in the child timeline. Well, here's where things start to get a little tricky. Let's look into some of the lore provided to us about the Zora featured in Breath of the Wild. History of the Zora, Part 1, The Eternal Zoras Domain, as told by King Dorphan. The rains have blessed Lanayru since ancient times with an abundance of pure, clean water. Seeking a bounty of such water, the Zora gathered here. Thus, as the legends go, the domain was born 10,000 years ago. The land was also rich in ore, and so a unique form of stone masonry was developed to create our new home. The domain is one giant sculpture, a feat of architecture that has drawn admirers from the world over. Our great domain will ever stand as a hallmark of the esteemed artists who made it, an eternal symbol of Zora pride. Okay, so we can pretty much be sure that the Zoras Domain in Breath of the Wild is the same Zoras Domain as in Ocarina of Time, Twilight Princess, and any other Zelda game. The stone tablets about the history of the Zora in Breath of the Wild discuss how the Zora moved into the domain, forming their civilization 10,000 years ago. The tablet states that this was also the time they designed the giant fish sculpture present in the domain. But something's not quite adding up here. 10,000 years ago? As in, around the time of the first Calamity event 10,000 years ago? How could the Zoras Domain have been presumably founded around the same time the Divine Beasts were made? Maybe I'm assuming a bit here, but it always seemed to me that the first Calamity Ganon event occurred sometime after the end of any of the known timelines, with Breath of the Wild taking place 100 years after that. In the first video, I briefly went over the history and plot of the game. Now I'm going to be going back a little farther so we can figure this whole 10,000 year thing out. You see, the Calamity Ganon seen in Breath of the Wild is presumably a new incarnation of the primal evil that's plagued Hyrule throughout its history. 10,000 years prior to the events of Breath of the Wild, it appeared to ravage the world. It was for the purpose of driving back this beast that the Sheikah constructed the Divine Beasts and the army of Guardians. Mounting a successful attack, Ganon was driven back to be sealed beneath Hyrule Castle. Following this, 100 years prior to Breath of the Wild, a prophecy warned of Calamity Ganon's return. And that's where my history lesson at the top of the previous episode came into play. The people of Hyrule excavated the Divine Beasts and gathered 4 champions while Zelda tried to awaken her powers. Ultimately, they failed and Link was put to rest for 100 years. We know, with a little assistance from the Zelda Encyclopedia, that over the course of the series, while Ganon has returned several times, he's only been officially reincarnated once. We know that Ganon found his origin in Ocarina of Time. Prior to this, other villains threatened Hyrule, which, if the legend is suggesting that it was indeed Ganon who attacked 10,000 years ago, it can't have possibly happened prior to Ocarina of Time, or really anywhere else on the known timeline. In Ocarina of Time, Ganondorf appeared as a man from the Rito Tribe, and later, at the end of the game, he transformed into the beast known as Ganon, distinct in the absence of the Dorf suffix from his name. Following the events of the game, the timeline splits in 3. In the adult timeline, Ganondorf returns in the Wind Waker and is soundly defeated by the Hero of Winds, and remains sealed under the Great Sea. He doesn't return in this timeline, as immediately following this, Link and Tetra travel to a new land where they found a brand new Hyrule. In the Fallen Hero timeline, Ganon is sealed by the sages in the absence of Link. He breaks free and Link to the past, still in his beast form, before being defeated by a new hero. He's revived again and defeated by the same hero, an Oracle of Ages and Seasons linked ending. The next time he appears in this timeline is in A Link Between Worlds, where the Sorcerer Yuga summons Ganon's soul and merges with him before once again being defeated by a new hero. Finally, Ganon returns in the original Legend of Zelda game where he steals the Triforce of Power and is again defeated by a new hero. Pretty straightforward. In one timeline, he's finished off, and in another, he seems doomed to repeat a cycle of revival and defeat. But it's when we get to the child timeline that things start to take a different form. Ganon appears twice in the child timeline. In Twilight Princess, we appear to get a situation that's almost a mix of the other two timelines. Ganondorf's plans in Ocarina of Time are thwarted early by the young hero of time returning from the future. As a result, the sages seal Ganondorf away in the Twilight Realm. But just as he did in the Wind Waker, Ganondorf returns. Things are different this time, however, likely due to the fact that the hero of time definitely existed in this timeline, and maybe had a bloodline linking to another hero? As a result, a new hero rises to defeat him. Here, Ganondorf dies, and the next time we see Ganon is in Four Swords Adventures, reborn in the new beastly incarnation of Ganon, King of Darkness, and of course he's defeated, again. This time sealed away in the Four Sword. What happens to him next is a mystery, so we can assume at some point Ganon again reincarnated into the Calamity Ganon we've come to know in Breath of the Wild. With all of that in mind, I think it's safe to assume that whenever this 10,000 years ago takes place, it had to have been after any of the events we've seen in the timeline, which still means that I've got some questions about this apparent founding of the Zoras Domain 10,000 years ago. It's still a bit early to come to any particular conclusions just yet, so let's see if there's anything else we can glean from the Zoras history. History of the Zora, Part 5. The Sage Princess Rito, as told by King Dorphin. Long, long ago, in a past more distant than even the Great Calamity, or the creation of the divine beast Vah Ruta, there was a Zora princess named Rito. We know that she was an attendant to the Zora patron deity, and that she was a fair and lively girl, beloved to all. Around that same time, an evil man with designs on ruling the world appeared, bringing disaster upon Zora's Domain. It is said that Rito then awoke as a sage, facing this foe alongside the Princess of Hyrule and the hero of legend. Her achievements are remembered not only by the Zora, they are also forever etched in the history of Hyrule. The divine beast Vah Ruta, built ages later to face off against Calamity Ganon, was named in honor of Rito. That the Zora princess, my sweet daughter Mipha, was chosen to pilot Ruta is surely the work of fate. So, wow, okay, there's a lot of information crammed in there. I'll break it all down for you. First, it seems to prove what I've been saying about Zora's Domain existing prior to 10,000 years ago. It literally says so. Long, long ago, in a past more distant than even the Great Calamity or the creation of the divine beast Vah Ruta, further reinforcing this with the line, the divine beast Vah Ruta, built ages later to face off against Calamity Ganon, was named in honor of Rito, meaning the divine beast created 10,000 years ago were, made after Ocarina of Time, and thus after the establishment of Zora's Domain. We know the events with the Calamity Ganon couldn't have taken place between Ocarina of Time and some other game because of Ganon's history, with him only ever actually reincarnating at the end of the child timeline. We need to make sense of this, but first there's another small detail I need to address. The tablet states, around that same time, an evil man with designs of ruling the world appeared, bringing disaster upon Zora's Domain. It is said that Rito then awoke as a sage, facing this foe alongside the Princess of Hyrule and the hero of legend. Wait a minute. Haven't I been adamantly stating and proving that Breath of the Wild takes place at the end of the child timeline? This single statement alone seems to fly in the face of everything I've been building up. That's why we need to get really crafty. It's time to stop and use our brains. Many theorists like to use this as evidence for Breath of the Wild existing in the adult or fallen timelines, but I beg to differ. Here's what we know. In Ocarina of Time, Link was transported 7 years into the future, where he awakened the 7 sages and defeated, or fell to, Ganondorf. This battle across time created a split timeline. In the hero's defeat, we get the Fallen Hero timeline. in which the awakened sages use their power to seal Ganon away in the Sacred Realm without the aid of Link in an event known as the Imprisoning War. With the hero's victory, we get the other two timelines. In the adult timeline, the events of Ocarina of Time have all come to pass, and we end with Hyrule and the future state where Link is an adult and the sages are awakened. Link is sent back to his own timeline and essentially no longer exists in the adult timeline. The child timeline is again where things start to change. You see, after Link is sent back to his own time, he doesn't just sit on his hands and do nothing, nor does he immediately go off to find Navi, initiating his quest in Majora's Mask. Rather, we know from the implications of Twilight Princess, and later confirmed by the Hyrule Historia and Encyclopedia, that Link returned to Hyrule Castle and thwarted Ganondorf's plans before they came to fruition. But this is all a little vague. We really don't know exactly what happened here. If we take a look at the events recounted in Twilight Princess, we can get a few hints, however, that may lead to a better understanding of the situation. In Twilight Princess, the sages residing in the Arbiter's grounds recount the tale of how they sealed Ganon away in the Twilight Realm. So, what? The sages sealed him away? But that would imply they were awakened, wouldn't it? Given the appearance of the seven sages in Twilight Princess, many people, myself included, assumed that the reason they appeared this way was because they hadn't been awakened, and were instead, spirit versions of the sages or something. But with the way Zelda lore seems to work, I'm not so sure that concept really holds water. I think they actually were awakened. Young Link, after informing the princess her suspicions about Ganondorf are correct, went around and gathered the sages once more, initiating a new version of the Imprisoning War. Whether this war lasted years or merely weeks is unclear. It's entirely possible that Link's journey to Termina occurred while this war was going on. Without more details on the situation, it's difficult to really figure that out. But what we do know is that Princess Ruto, along with the other sages, must have been awakened in order to initiate this sealing war. I think here we've reached a situation where the development process of the game comes into play a little bit more than the actual lore of the series. It seems to me that the reason the sages appear the way they do, all nearly identical and in sort of a spirit-like form, could both be a result of the game's style and simply cutting the corners of having to create 7 unique assets for such a short scene. It's clear that in the time between Ocarina of Time and Twilight Princess that the sages themselves likely did eventually morph into the form we see in Twilight Princess, having perhaps shed away their physical forms. I think from a lore standpoint you could potentially argue that the sages retain their spirit appearance in the flashback because Link is imagining the story being told to him, similar to the vision of the Dark Interlopers shown to Link by the Light Spirit. It really just seems to be a simple matter of not wasting resources by making new unnecessary assets, although I really would have loved to see the Seven Sages reimagined in the Twilight Princess art style. Coincidentally, while reviewing the Hyrule Historia, I came across a design sketch for the sages, with one originally being the concept for Rauru, with his face hidden behind a mask, much like the sages we get in the game. This seems to support the idea that they once had plans to implement Twilight Princess versions of the Seven Sages before opting to go a simpler route and making them all look identical as we see in the game itself. Suffice it to say, there's no evidence to suggest Princess Ruto couldn't have been awakened in the child timeline. Speaking of which, watch the scene and look at the sage Ganondorf kills. It's the Water Sage. In that moment, Ganondorf is fueled by the Triforce of Power and kills Sage Ruto. After her death, she's remembered as a hero, just as the tablet said. So where does this leave us now? Well, what all of this means is that it's still very possible for Breath of the Wild to take place at the end of the child timeline, if not even more likely. But we still haven't solved that thing about 10,000 years ago. So here we go again. It's about time I let you in on my little theoretical secret. The Zora featured in Breath of the Wild are not the same species of Zora we saw in Ocarina of Time. Rather, they are, in fact, the colony of Zora from the Zora Cape in Majora's Mask. You still with me? In my last video, I put forth the concept of a Goron migration, ending up merging with the culture of the Hylian Gorons, and later carving the face of the great warrior Darmani into the Death Mountain. But it's not the only evidence of a migration pattern. To see what I'm talking about, let's take a quick look at the Zoras Domain and its history. The first time we encountered the Zoras Domain is in Ocarina of Time. It's not really very similar to the one we see today in Breath of the Wild at all. But as time passes, so too do things change. It's worth noting that at this point in the timeline, the Zora maintain a strong friendly relationship with the royal family, which is something that can't be said of every timeline. In the adult timeline, they evolved into the Rito, of course, but in the Fallen Hero timeline, their relationship with the royal family slowly diminished until they became a hostile force rather than friendly. Along with this, their appearance also changes pretty drastically, but hey, I heard they like mudkips. Following the events of A Link Between Worlds, the Zora split into two factions, one attempting to reclaim their former glory, while the other remaining hostile. The hostile sort seems to prevail, being the type we see in the original Legend of Zelda game. Adding some credence to our child timeline theory, the Zora of that particular timeline remain loyal to the royal family, as well as continuing to live in prosperity with their own royalty. Looking at the Zoras Domain featured in Twilight Princess, however, it still looks totally different from the one we see in Breath of the Wild. Well, just to cover all of our bases, why don't we take a look at the architecture of the Zora Hall and the Zora Cape? Wait. Hold on a second. Isn't that... I gotta say, this fish design looks extremely familiar. It's nearly identical, albeit smaller and a lot more modest, to the design of Breath of the Wild's Zora's Domain. It's almost a perfect architectural match. For that matter, the Great Bay Temple is also a very similarly designed structure as well. It's a bit uncanny. With this architectural evidence as our proof, we can presume that, after the events of Majora's Mask, like the Gorons, the Zora too migrated to the Zora's Domain, mingling with the other Zora there. But then, what about the Rito again? Sure, maybe the regional changes might result in the new colors we see added to the Zora in Breath of the Wild, but this really doesn't sound like they would have just up and become birds. They aren't even in that area. Well, here's the thing. I mentioned that the child timeline was unique in the sense that the Zora of this timeline remained loyal to the royal family and their kingdom, but that's not entirely true. What I didn't talk about were the events of Four Swords Adventures. Here we see a hostile Zora race, very similar to how they turned out in the Fallen Hero timeline. So, what happened to those guys? Something interesting I found during my research was the fact that Majora's Mask isn't actually the only time we've seen saltwater Zora. They also made an appearance in the land of Labrynna in Oracle of Ages. Here, they actually coexist alongside the freshwater Zora, being distinguished as the peaceful group between the two types of Zora, whereas the freshwater Zora were hostile. One saltwater Zora in the game even refers to the freshwater Zora as savage and vulgar. Furthermore, there is also a Zora in the linked gameplay of the Oracle games who is searching for a place to build a new domain by order of the Zora King. The Oracle games take place in the Fallen Hero timeline. As with the awakening of Princess Rito, there's no evidence to suggest that a similar occurrence couldn't have happened in the child timeline. You know, like the saltwater Zora from Termina migrating into Hyrule and finding a new domain. Something that might have happened, say, 10,000 years ago, where they redesigned it in their own aesthetic and cast out the hostile freshwater Zora from the land. Perhaps following this, the freshwater Zora likewise migrated to the Great Bay, where they evolved into the Rito Tribe due to the saltwater, much like in the Wind Waker. Wow, okay, that was a lot of non-map related content. But now that all of that is out of the way, we can finally begin to form an idea of how this landscape has changed over time. Back during the time of Majora's Mask, the Great Bay used to be a large ocean home for the Zora. However, in Breath of the Wild, that's all changed. Somehow, over time, almost all of the ocean waters have dried up, with the exception of a few small lakes. The Rito have made their home in the appropriately named Rito Village at the center of Lake Toturi. If Lake Toturi sounds familiar to you, besides being one letter off from being Lake Totoro, it was also the name of the Zora King's Termina doppelganger, Toto, the manager of the famous band, the Indigogos. There aren't really too many other references to the Zora from Termina around the Rito Village, with most of the references having been placed fittingly around the Zoras Domain in the form of Toto, Lulu, and Mikau Lake. Lulu and Mikau being members of the Indigogos and prominent characters in Majora's Mask. Although we do get a reference to the Rito Prince from the Wind Waker in Kolami Bridge, a clear reference to Prince Komali. So let's finally head over to our map and see how well the Great Bay and Tabantha Frontier line up. We can start by taking note that the Rito Village just so happens to line up pretty much perfectly with the Zora Cape, but that's not our only clue. In Breath of the Wild, one of the major defining landmarks of the Tabantha Frontier is the Rito Flight Range, where Revali and his descendants once trained and practiced their marksmanship. This area appears as a deep pit with a single spire raised at its center. Exploring this area in Majora's Mask, I was struck by how the location was nearly identical to Termina's Pinnacle Rock. Not only that, but it also lined up almost perfectly on the map. The only real difference is the presence of the spire in the center. Well, that actually ended up being pretty easy. The hardest location to find in all of this was the pirate stronghold. In Breath of the Wild, the stronghold seems to have vanished almost entirely, leaving little trace, if any, of where it once stood. But based on the Majora's Mask map and some similar landscaping, I think it's safe to pinpoint this location as Breath of the Wild's Rasporo Pass. However, with all the water in the region having dried up, there are no real clues to tell us if this was a place once inhabited by the pirates. I was kinda hoping I'd have the time to tackle the next area in this video, but after all that explaining I had to do about the Zora, I think I'm gonna have to split it one more time, which is fitting, I suppose. My intentions were for this particular theory to only last for 3 episodes, but as is traditional for the land of Termina, it looks like this could be a 4-part story. What I have to discuss next is, likewise, pretty crazy, so I hope you all enjoy what I have to say about the Stone Tower in the next episode. I'll see you real soon.